Hello, and welcome back to Afjer Audiobooks. Today, I'll be reading one of my all-time favorite series, starting with Book 1. This is Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1, The Ruins of Gorlan, by John Flanagan. If you want to read more from John Flanagan, his name is spelled Johnflanagan, also shown on the screen. Trust me when I say that he is a fantastic author. Before we begin, keep in mind that I have little access to editing software and very little experience with editing, so this will definitely not be the best audiobook you've ever heard. Let us begin. Chapter 7. It felt strange to be leaving the castle after all these years. Will turned back at the bottom of the hill, a small bundle of belongings slung over his shoulder, and stared up at the massive walls. Castle Redmont dominated the landscape. Built on top of a small hill was a massive, three-sided structure, facing roughly west with a tower at each of the three corners. In the center, protected by the three curtain walls, were the castle yard and the keep, a fourth tower that soared above the others and housed the Baron's official quarters and his private living apartments, along with those of his senior officers. The castle was built in iron stone, a rock that was almost indestructible and, in the low sun of early morning or late afternoon, seemed to glow in an inner red light. It was this characteristic that gave the castle its name, Redmont, or Red Mountain. At the foot of the hill, on the other side of the Tarvis River, lay Wensley Village, a cheerfully haphazard cluster of houses with an inn and those craft shops necessary to meet the demands of day-to-day country life. Cooper, wheelwright, smithy, and harness-maker. The land around these had been cleared for some distance, both to provide farmlands for the villagers and to tend and to prevent enemies from being able to approach unseen. In times of danger, the villagers would drive their flocks across the wooden bridge that spanned the Tarvis, removing the center span behind them, and seek shelter behind the massive ironstone walls of the castle, protected by the Baron's soldiers and the knights trained in Redmont's battle school. Holt's cottage lay some distance away from both castle and village, nestling under the shelter of the trees at the edge of the forest. The sun was just rising over the trees as Will made his way to the log cabin. A thin spiral of smoke was rising from the chimney, so Will reasoned that Holt was already up and about. He stepped up onto the veranda that ran across the length of one side of the house, hesitated for a moment, then, taking a deep breath, he knocked firmly on the door. "Come in," said a voice from inside. Will opened the door and went into the cottage. It was small, but surprisingly neat and comfortable. Looking inside, he found himself in the main room, a combined living and dining area with a small kitchen at one end, separated from the main area by a pine bench. There were comfortable chairs ranged around the fire, a well-scrubbed wooden table, and pots and pans that gleamed from much polishing. There was even a vase of brightly colored wildflowers on the mantel shelf, and the early morning sun streamed cheerfully through a large window. Two other rooms led off the main room. Holt sat in one of the chairs, his booted feet resting on the table. "At least you're on time," he said gruffly. "Have you had your breakfast yet?" "Yes, sir," said Will, staring in fascination at the ranger. This was the first time he had ever seen Holt without his gray-green cloak and hood. The ranger was wearing simple brown and gray woolen clothes and soft-looking leather boots. He was older than Will had realized. His hair and beard were short and dark, but peppered with steel-gray flecks. They were both roughly trimmed, and Will thought they looked as if Holt had cut them himself with his hunting knife. The ranger stood up. He was surprisingly small in build. That was something else that Will had never realized. The gray cloak concealed a lot about Holt. He was slim and not at all tall. In fact, he was considerably shorter than average height. There was a sense of power and whipcord strength about him, so that his lack of height and bulk didn't make him any less daunting a figure. "Finished staring?" asked the ranger suddenly. Will jumped nervously. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir," he said. Holt grunted. He pointed to one of the small rooms Will had noticed as he entered. "That'll be your room. You can put your things in there." He moved away to the wood stove in the kitchen area, and Will hesitantly entered the room he had indicated. It was small, but, like the rest of the cottage, it was also clean and comfortable looking. A small bed lay alongside one wall. There was a wardrobe for clothes, and a rough table with a washing basin and jug on it. There was also, Will noticed, another vase of freshly picked wildflowers, adding a bright spot of color to the room. He put a small bundle of clothes and belongings on the bed and went back into the main room. Holt was still busy by the stove, his back to Will. Will coughed apologetically to attract his attention. Holt continued to stir coffee into a pot on the stove. Will coughed again. "Got a cold, boy?" asked the ranger without turning around. No, sir." "Then why are you coughing?" asked Holt, turning around to face him. Will hesitated. "Well, sir," he began uncertainly, "I just wanted to ask you, what does a ranger actually do?" He doesn't ask pointless questions, boy," said Holt. "He keeps his eyes and ears open, and he looks and listens, and eventually, if he hasn't got too much cotton wool behind his ears, he learns." "Oh," said Will. "I see." He didn't, and even though he realized that this was probably no time to ask more questions, he couldn't help himself repeating a little rebelliously, "I just wondered what rangers do is all." Holt caught the tone in his voice and turned to him, a strange gleam in his eye. "Well then, I suppose I'd better tell you," he said. "What rangers do, or more correctly what rangers' apprentices do, is the housework." Will had a sinking feeling as the suspicion struck him that he had made a tactical error. "The housework?" he repeated. Holt nodded, looking distinctly pleased with himself. "That's all right. Look around. Take a look around." He paused, gesturing around the interior of the cabin for Will to do as he suggested, and continued. "See any servants?" "No, sir," Will said slowly. "No, sir, indeed," Will said, "because this isn't a mighty castle with a staff of servants. This is a lowly cabin, and there's water to be fetched, and firewood to be chopped, and floors to be swept, and rugs to be beaten. And who do you suppose might do all these things, boy?" Will tried to think of some answer other than the one which now seemed inevitable. Nothing came to mind, so he finally said, in a defeated tone, "Would that be me, sir?" "I believe it would be," the ranger told him, then rattled off a list of instructions crisply. "Bucket there, barrel outside the door, water in the river, axe in the lean-to, firewood behind the cabin, broom by the door, and I believe you can probably see where the floor might be." "Yes, sir," said Will, beginning to roll up his sleeves. He noticed the water barrel as he approached, obviously holding the day's water supply for the cabin. He estimated that it would hold 20 or 30 buckets full. With a sigh, he realized he was going to have a busy morning. As he walked outside, the empty bucket in one hand, he heard the ranger say contentedly as he poured himself a mug of coffee and sat down again, "I'd forgotten how much fun having an apprentice can be." Will couldn't believe that such a small and seemingly neat cottage could generate so much cleaning and general maintenance. After he had filled the water barrel with fresh river water, 31 buckets full, he chopped wood from a stack of logs behind the cabin, piling the split firewood into a neat stack. He swept out the cabin, then, after Holt decided that the rug on the living room floor needed beating, he rolled it up, carried it outside, and draped it over a rope slung between two trees, beating it savagely so the clouds of dust flew from it. From time to time, Holt leaned out the window to give him encouragement, which usually consisted of curt comments such as, "You've missed a bit on the left side," or "Put some energy into it, boy." When the rug had been replaced on the floor, Holt cited that several of his cooking pots didn't gleam with sufficient intensity. "We'll have to give them a bit of scouring," he said, more or less to himself. Will knew by now that this translated to, "You'll have to give them a bit of scouring." So, without a word, he took the pots to the river's edge and half filled them with water and fine sand, scouring and polishing the metal until it gleamed. Holt, meanwhile, had moved to a canvas chair on the veranda, where he sat reading through a tall pile of what looked to be official communications. Passing by once or twice, Will noticed that several of the papers bore crests and coat of arms, while the vast majority were headed with a simple oak leaf design. When Will returned from the river bank, he held the pots up for Holt's inspection. The ranger grimaced at his distorted reflection in the bright copper surface. Not bad. Can see my own face in it," he said, then added without a hint of a smile, "May not be such a good thing." Will said nothing. With anyone else he might have suspected it was a joke, but with Holt he simply couldn't tell. Holt studied him for a second or two. Then his shoulders lifted slightly in a shrug as he gestured for Will to return the pots to the kitchen. Will was halfway through the door when he heard Holt behind him say, "That's odd." Thinking the ranger might be talking to him, Will paused at the door. "I beg your pardon?" he said suspiciously. Each time Holt had found a new chore for him to attend to, he seemed to begin the instruction with a statement like, "How unusual. The living room is full of dust," or, "I do believe the stove is in dire need of a new supply of firewood." It was an affectation that Will had found more than a little annoying over the day, although Holt seemed to be quite fond of it. This time, however, it seemed that he had been genuinely musing to himself as he read through a new report. One of the oak leaf crested ones, Will noted. Now the ranger looked up, a little surprised that Will had addressed him. "What's that?" he said. Will shrugged. "Sorry, when you said, 'that's odd,' I thought you were talking to me." Holt shook his head several times, still frowning at the report in his hands. No, he said, a trifle distractedly. "I was just reading this." His voice trailed away and he frowned thoughtfully. Will, his curiosity roused, waited expectantly. "What is it?" he finally ventured to ask. As the ranger turned those dark eyes on him, he instantly wished he hadn't. Holt regarded him for a second or two. "Curious, are you?" he asked at length, and when Will nodded uncomfortably, he went on in an unexpectedly milder tone. "Well, I suppose that's a good trait for a ranger's apprentice. After all, that's why we tested you with the paper in the Baron's office." "You tested me?" Will set the heavy copper kettle down by the door. "You expected me to try and see what it said?" Holt nodded. "Would have been disappointed if you hadn't. Also, I wanted to see how you'd go about it." Then he held up a hand to forestall the torrent of questions that were about to tumble out of Will's mouth. "We'll discuss that later," he said, glancing meaningfully at the kettle and the other pots. Will stooped to retrieve them, and turned back to the house once more, but curiosity still burned in him, and he turned to the ranger again. "So what does it say?" he asked, nodding toward the report. Again there was a silence as Holt regarded him, perhaps assessing him. He said, "Lord Northolt is dead, apparently killed by a bear last week while out hunting." "Lord Northolt?" Will asked. The name was vaguely familiar to him, but he couldn't place it. "Former Supreme Commander of the King's Army," Holt told him, and Will nodded as if he had known this, but since Holt seemed to be answering his questions, he was emboldened to continue. "What's so odd about that? After all, bears do kill people from time to time." Holt nodded. "True, but I would have thought Cordham Fief was a little far west for bears, and I would have thought Nordhold would be too experienced a hunter to go after one alone." He shrugged as if dismissing the thoughts. "But then again, life is full of surprises, and people do make mistakes." He gestured toward the kitchen again, indicating that the conversation was over. "When you've put those away, you might like to clean out the fireplace," he said. Will moved to do as he was told, but a few minutes later he was walking past one of the windows to a large fireplace took up most of one wall in the living room. He glanced out to see the ranger tapping the report thoughtfully on his chin, his thoughts obviously a long way away. And that is the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next reading. Bye.